This is Nadia.
I see your name's on the screen there, so I know who it is. You can't do anonymous here.
Good. Perfect.
Yeah, it's on my screen. Not your, you're not, there you are. You're on there.
There you go.
Okay, everybody. We'll get started because I think everybody either here or online, it's going to be here. I'll pass around the Shabbat attendance. You can mark me as being absent this Shabbat. I didn't make it to shul. My wife wasn't feeling well. I wasn't feeling well, so we didn't want to make anybody else sick. Last week in the Torah portion, we started the section, which is really the second half of the book of Exodus for the most part, talking about the tabernacle and everything that's involved with the tabernacle, the Mishkan. So last week was mostly concerned with the actual construction of it, what it was to be made out of. And this week it turns to the discussion of the garb of the Kohanim, their garments. And well, for the most part, it doesn't affect anything Jewish today in terms of dress. Certainly, I think there are certain things in the Catholic Church that derive from the biblical description of what the priests wore. I think to a certain extent that's true. The only major thing that stands out is that the Torah proscribes mixing wool and linen. You're not supposed to wear clothing in which there's a mixture of those two. One's an animal product, perhaps, and the other is a plant product, maybe that. We have no rational explanation why that should be. Right? So I'm not going to attempt to do that. But that was probably my fun. But yeah. But one thing that is leads some people to try and understand what is going on is that the priests wore garments. There were a mixture of wool and linen. The tabernacle had some of the material in it was a mixture of wool and linen. So perhaps that is some way related to the idea that we don't, traditionally we're not supposed to mix wool and linen in our clothing. So that is this week's Torah portion. Also with it is it's the Shabbat preceding Purim. I mentioned last week about the 4 special Shabbatot. There's the Shabbat preceding the first Rosh Chodesh of Adar, preceding Rosh Chodesh Adar. Let's put it that way. That's when we read Parshat Shekalim. We read about the shekels being collected. The Shabbat before Purim is the Shabbat of Zachor. Zachor Tasher Asalacha Amalek. To remember what Amalek did to you. Thank you. And I is online I explained how there is a connection between Haman and Amalek, Agag. But in today's world, there really is no Amalek, except on a certain spiritual level, you might think of that. Certainly no one has the right in Jewish law to, quote, destroy Amalek in this world. The idea is yes, but God forbid in terms of people. And that's why this past week in Israel was such an unfortunate event in which some Israeli Jews attacked their Arab neighbors. Okay. And that's certainly, no matter what the political situation is, something that is really just not acceptable as far as I'm concerned. Okay. So that is leading up. And of course, Purim is this coming week. All right. I hope everybody plans on attending the synagogue at least in the evening, if not evening in the morning. Different synagogues have different styles, how they do things. And some the adults get dressed up in costumes as well. Where I usually go, there will always be some adults in costumes, of course, lots of kids in costumes, and all kinds of noise making. and sometimes a few hip flasks or what have you, that may be available. Okay. All right, we are in the Hebrew. Let's see, we left off at, we did the scene, yeah, it's, we're up to page 46, aren't we?
He's had the book all the time. I haven't had it, so.
What, okay. Because last week we had the letter sin, right? The sin was the shin with the dot on the left-hand side. All right,
An extra book, Benny.
by chance. How do you know which one is the shin and which one is the sin?
Where the duck is.
Where the dot is, all right? But also, how do you know which one is which?
If you're on the right, it's the chin, and if it's on the
Left.
left, it's the.
Okay, it's the left is always sinister. In Latin,
That's what it is.
the word for left is sinistra. So the left is sinister. I have another one too, by chance. There's a need for a third one? Another book? All right. Okay. I don't know why we have a shin and a sin. I really don't. When we talk about the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, it's just shin. We don't usually distinguish between the shin and the sin. Right? So, and there's no rule to know when it is a shin or is it page 45. Okay. So it's always going to be an S. When it's on the left, it's sinister, therefore it's going to be S. Okay. So line number 1. All right, everybody together? Line number 1.
45.
Page 45, line 1, sin, S is in Sarah. All right. Si, say, se, sa, sai, su, se, su, so. Okay. Line number 2. Sar, sam, sham, shas, shas, satan, sarai. What is Satan? It becomes Satan, but in the biblical world, it's not Satan. It's Satan, the accuser, God's prosecuting attorney. It's not this nefarious, evil creature. Okay, but the English word Satan derives from that word. But just know it in the Bible, when we look at that, when we come to the book of Job, and we did it when we looked at Job. Remember, Satan was just the accuser. Right? Later on, with cross influences, it takes on a little more of an evil, perhaps, aspect, but it's never really an independent force from God.
The accuser.
And as an aside, because I've been reading a book I've meant to read for years, it's actually an old book, it's Jewish Magic and Superstition. What Trachtenberg's thesis is that when it comes to the concept of magic, in the Middle Ages, magic was often seen as the area of the non-godly. All right? I'll use that language. It was a separate power. Satan had the separate power. Satanic rites, witches, and all of that was considered to be evil because against God. While the concept of a witch does exist in the Bible, it's not the same idea. Furthermore, since there is no power, simple power that is in opposition to God, the Jewish concept of magic as it developed was very, very different. And it is usually dealing with the concept of demons and somehow either mostly protecting yourself from demonic influences in the world. And that's where Jewish magic and superstition came about. Okay. No, Harry Houdini tried to disprove it. Okay. As they said, who didn't? All right, line number 3. Line number 3. Shone. So. Now, okay, let's try and analyze this. Okay. We're using now the old style of the Hebrew. In the first word, there's the dot, the first dot has to be the dot for the shin. Can't be anything else. The second dot stands in place of the vowel sound O. Okay? In the Koran Siddur, Art Scroll Siddur, many other works today, they will put in 2 dots. If they're instead of 1 dot, if it needs to have 2, because the second one has to be soneh. Why? Because there's no the letter, the consonant must have a vowel sound associated following it. So what I'm going to say is in the Koran Siddur, the Art Scroll Siddur, many Siddurim today, there would be 2 dots there to make life a lot easier for us. Okay, but you're going to come across Hebrew from time to time that it was not done that way. So you look at it and analyze it and take 10 minutes to figure it out while they're reading it all together in the next page. But that's got to be soneh. Okay, yes. Well, see, if you put in a vav, and again, modern Hebrew might do that, it has a grammatical effect. The vav would be a long vowel. So when you have the letter vav with a dot above it, that's a long vowel. And that would create its own grammatical issues unless you know it's just a spelling help. So yes, modern Israeli Hebrew often ignores that to make it easier to read. Okay, line 3, third word. Sameach, Samecha, Simcha. What is Sameach and Samecha and Simcha? Joy, celebration, exactly. Line number 4. Sarah, Shechenut, Maskoret, Shadchan, Iskir. Okay. Line number 5. Shava, Sove, Shituf, Sha'on, Sadeh. Line number 6. Ke'asu, Hechelit, She'asa, La'avotechem, Sorek. Right? So to make life interesting, the next letter on the next page, the letter Sin, or Samech, excuse me, it's just like the Sin. It's an S. You never have to guess. It's always an S. And now, the letter that you can get confused with is the final mem. Now, the way to distinguish is when you write the final mem, it's always corners or it's squares. It's a square. All right, the line might protrude on top or something, but you're going to have clearly 4 corners. The samach is always going to be curved. There's a slope to the samach. And you cannot have the final mem at the beginning of a word, so that tells you right away that it's a samach. So the only time you should have a problem is at the end of a word. So if you look and see if there's a slope, surely that is the samach and not the mem. Remember that. Okay, it's an S, as in sukkah. So line number 1, sa, sai, su, so, say, se, si, su. Okay, line number 2. Sar, sar, seer, sal, nace, pas, dash. Line number 3. Nisim, shas, sham, pasim, hayas, koes. Line number 4. Matos, samech, sameach, sechach, lehistakel. Take a look at the last one, lehistakel, to stare at it. Okay. Line number 5. Hiskim, sika, silsel, sandak, sof, sin. Line number 6. Safsal, seret, he speak, sifriya, saif. Line number 7. Sulam, shalom, sechar, sukariot, sukkot. What's sukariot? Candy. It's a sweet word, right? Not to be confused with sukkah. What? Everybody get there really are sukkah. There are candies there. Okay. All right, we're going to say the Zion for the next time we're together, because that's going to be the end of the alphabet for us. All right, and you make a Shechiyanu and all of that in a couple of weeks. Okay. All right. One of the when I plan out the year, as I've explained, I think to you before, schedule the sessions on the various holidays prior to the holidays. And I try to get the biblical literature and rabbinic literature as early as possible in the time. And a lot of things that are more difficult get pushed to later on. And philosophy is one of them. Why do we do this? A good question. You know, I doubt sincerely if any of the rabbis are going to ask you any questions about Jewish philosophy if you go before the Beit Din. I, on the other hand, will have a question or two on the test. Not in great depth, but the idea is that we want you to have a feeling for all of what Judaism is about. And philosophy, Jewish philosophy, has been a major element of Jewish thought throughout the post-biblical age. It has often been and still is a challenge to traditional religion. Philosophy supposedly is the love of knowledge, right? And it is supposed to be not limited in any way, although we know the reality is much more complex than that. And in every age, Jewish thinkers have had to deal with the zeitgeist, the world around them, the thoughts that are going in the world around them. Even people who try to isolate themselves, some of the Hasidic groups that try to isolate themselves from the world as much as possible, nonetheless some of this seeps in and has to be dealt with. So most of the scholars in Judaism who were renowned scholars, many of them were also philosophers. And they had to deal with defending Jewish ideas in either against or in accordance with the philosophies that were around them. So it's important for you to have at least a feeling for it, even if you don't have any great depth in terms of philosophy, which I don't claim to have great depth. Rabbi Allen, who teaches the other class, has his MA in philosophy, and although it's in some English philosopher that I'm sure he doesn't care about, but had to do it for his work. Okay, so the first philosopher that we meet on the line of Jewish philosophers was really mostly ignored by Judaism until most recently. He was Philo of Alexandria. He died around the year 50 of the Common Era. Now, Alexandria in Egypt, I don't, if we haven't touched upon it, was a Greek city, but it really was composed of, I don't know exact figures, but a third of it was Greek, a third of it was Jewish, and a third was native Egyptian. And the Jews and the Greeks often were at odds with each other, just as ethnic rivalries. You know, no different in some corners of the world where you had immigration and the Irish and the Italians fought each other. Okay, that's just a reality. And so Philo fits into this world, but it's a Greek world. So Greek philosophy was vitally important to anyone who wants to be considered to be an intellectual of that era. Now, we don't know a lot about Philo. We don't even know if he knew Hebrew at all. He seems to have relied, Philo, as in Philadelphia? Philadelphia.
Philo pastry.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. All right. Don't you know the F is always PH? I know, my apologies. So he seems to rely completely on the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Bible. And there are differences between our Masoretic text and the Septuagint text. And he wrote in Greek. And so he was really not known to most medieval Jewish philosophers, not until around the 16th century. Now, his approach was an attempt to reconcile, as we'll see a number of times, the Torah with Greek culture around him and philosophy. So, because, you know, it's like, let's say in Canada today, if you can't not deal with democracy in your religious world. Democracy is a value in Canada. And anybody who sought to ignore it in their theology and everything like that is going to have a problem. You have to deal with what is the current, the word for zeitgeist, the worldview. Weltanschauung is another fancy German word. The culture and the cultural ideas. And one of the things that he does, and we'll see this repeat itself in many different ways, was that by this stage of history, the Greek philosophers had really moved away from the paganism of the past. They weren't necessarily non-pagan, but they saw the gods of the Greeks in the past were barely really just big people. caused more trouble, had powers, but they were just people, really. You know, when you read all of the mythology of the Greeks and the Romans, you know, you can't really tell the difference between the gods and ordinary people in many ways, except they were able to do extra things. And so that was ridiculous. Well, you open up the Bible, God spoke. It was the hand of God. God got angry. How does that fit in with the deity? That's all anthropomorphisms. Okay? And so he said that biblical depictions of God were not to be taken literally, but metaphorically. God's anger means that the actions of people do not live up to the divine desire. It's not that God gets angry, but when it says in the Bible, God is angry, it means people are not living up to God's expectations. You know, that we'll see if the Rambam's a problem, but and now, while he accepted the biblical stories, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc., he sees them as being true. He also sees them as more than what's on the surface. He believes they're allegories, often meant to teach important lessons. Now, this allegorical interpretation of the biblical stories highly influenced Christianity. It did not really make an impact in the Jewish world. While allegory may be there in Midrash, etc., that was not very much seen as a Jewish way of seeing the Bible. And so he would argue that you had to observe the law. He was a Jew who accepted the teachings of that era, but he also felt they had other literary meanings. You had to follow them literally as well as allegorically. Such a position was not unknown in later Jewish circles, where, for example, the Rashbam, which is one of Rashi's grandsons, so we're talking about the 1100s of the Common Era, sometimes read biblical accounts not in accordance with traditional interpretation of the things. So, for example, Vayera Vayivoker, there was an evening, there was a morning. The Rashbam felt that it meant there was an evening, end of day one, and there was a morning, now we go into day two. So for him, he felt that the biblical account has the day beginning with dawn, which we know is contrary to Jewish tradition. Furthermore, he says elsewhere that you bind him as a sign upon your hands, should mean that be to you as if, you know, the back of your hand, you're confident in God's being, in God's existence, and God's law. Now, neither one of those things that the Rashbam says means he didn't believe the Jewish day starts at sunset, or really stars come out. Doesn't mean he didn't wear tefillin. But he did see that you could sometimes interpret something one way in a more literal, what he would call a literal interpretation, which is not what Philo was doing. He's giving allegorical interpretations. But he could say you could have something that's taken on a literal level, but was then interpreted by the rabbis in a different way, and both are important. For Philo, it was you had to follow the literal meaning of the text, but you could have also an allegorical explanation of it. It's not quite the same thing, but it was seeing two different truths being reflected in the same item. Everybody still with me? Okay. And now, so this is at the very beginning of the first millennia of the Common Era, right? But while we find what might be considered philosophical ideas here and there, we don't really come across any true philosophical writings until much later on. a man by the name of Saadia Gaon. Saadia Gaon, the years for his life, according to some, is 882 to 942 of the Common Era. Well, now, Saadia was Saadiah is one way of spelling it. There will be numerous ways of spelling Saadia. Okay, but Saadia Gaon was a Talmud scholar. He was head of one of the post-Talmudic academies in Baghdad. He also lived already in the early Muslim era. Right? So it was not a pagan world around him, but it was a world in which Islam was regnant. He had to deal with philosophical ideas that were floating around in the Muslim world, as well as Jewish tradition. And his famous work was entitled Emunot V'Deot, Beliefs and Opinions. Interestingly enough, he wrote it in Arabic. The Jews of his day mostly spoke Arabic. Aramaic was found in the studies in the academies when we were studying the Talmud, and Hebrew in prayer. But the common language, the lingua franca already at that stage of history, was Arabic. And so a lot of the Jewish philosophers in the Middle East, or the North Africa, Egypt, Spain, wrote their works in Arabic, which puts an extra layer of difficulty, because now it's either translated from Arabic to Hebrew, or from Arabic to English, or Arabic to Hebrew to English. So those are gulfs that are going to exist in understanding these things. Saadia was part of a strong tradition in Judaism of rationalist philosophers. Philo, to a certain extent, was a rationalist philosopher. Certainly Saadia was. And so as a rationalist, he sought to demonstrate that Judaism and Torah were compatible with the canons of reason. There could be nothing unreasonable in the Torah. There could be nothing unreasonable in Jewish tradition. Now, this concept that the human mind was capable of understanding everything, of reasoning it out, runs into a big roadblock in Jewish tradition, or it serves as a roadblock when it comes to the question of revelation. Revelation is God revealing his word, revealing his law. If the law is perfect, if the law is reasonable, why is there a need for revelation? Human beings can uncover that truth. So he has to explain not only that Judaism is compatible with reason, he has to defend Judaism against those who would say it's not compatible with reason. So his answer would be, you're making a mistake. Your reasoning power was faulty. Had you followed the correct reasoning approach, correct reasoning, you would see that Judaism was correct. Right? Now, I know that that's really a circular argument, but that is essentially what he and others try to say. Now, as to revelation, he says, yeah, the human mind is capable of what we might call uncovering the will of God. It's uncovering truth. But it's a long road. It takes a lot of studying, a lot of rational thought, and it's an arduous task, and not everyone is able to make the journey. And so revelation, especially for the hoi polloi, the ordinary person, is necessary to teach them how to lead a good life. You know, if you may be able to argue rationally that you must stop at a corner when a car is coming. Right? That's a very rational argument, because if you don't stop, there's going to be an accident. If you're a pedestrian, for sure, you're out of luck. That's very rational. But if there's a red light, you know you have to stop. You don't need to think about it. Right? Stop. The light's red. Stop. You don't sit and argue. Why would there be a red? Oh, the red light is there because there's going to be a car coming, and if I don't stop, I might walk in the front of it, I might get injured. So essentially, that's what he's saying. Revelation shortens the distance between what you do and what you have to do, and skips over all the reasoning that you have to make in order to get there. Because some people can't. You know, how many pedestrians today, you know, don't pay attention to what they're doing. So that he felt that it was necessary for the human race, and especially for the ordinary, and more so for the ordinary person. Now, how do you prove that revelation took place? I listened to a fellow on, well, I hate to say on YouTube, not YouTube, is he on TikTok or YouTube? One of those Michigas. Happens to be excellent. He's also, of all things, he's a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, but he's also a fantastic scholar of language, in Hebrew and Aramaic, many different languages. And he deals with all kinds of claims about Revelation, Bibles, and all that kind of stuff. And he disposes all kinds of what he considers to be misinterpretations of words. And so far, he's mostly talked about evangelical Christians preaching. But he says he's a member of the Mormon, what we used to call a Mormon Church, Church of Latter-day Saints. I have no idea how he deals with their teachings, but he's able to separate his church from his analysis of the Bible. He's certainly part and parcel of academia, modern academic studies, stuff that I would consider to be horrible in some places, right? Interestingly enough, you know, one of the things that in academia, they will pronounce the name of God, the Yud He Vav He, using the Yah pronunciation, and then a Wah pronunciation following, putting them together, which I would not do. And instead he says Adonai. So he explained one time, why does he do that? Because some of his Jewish followers said, you know, it makes us uncomfortable. So instead of just saying that as he would in an academic setting, he says Adonai. I found him fascinating. What's his name? Max something? Wait, all right. So now I have to figure out where I listen to him. Right? You know why he started TikTok? Because of this Jewish woman who was doing a Daf Yomi thing. Her reactions to the Daf. She's taking vacation right now, though. She's a bit of a stretch to her. What are we on here? All right, I'll look. Bli neder, as they say, without taking it to. I'll send you the information email to everybody if you're interested. All right. Anyway, so he would laugh at this explanation. All right. What is Sadia's explanation? We'll come across it again later on. How do we know God revealed the Torah? Because there were 6 million men at the foot of Mount Sinai who heard him. You have 6 million eyewitnesses, not a handful of people who saw somebody crucified and said he rose from the dead, not a few people who were around the Prophet Muhammad who gave them, who weren't even there when he got his revelations. These were people standing at the foot of Mount Sinai when God spoke, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Problem, of course, with that is what? How do we know they were there? Because the book that we're trying to defend says they were there. Says in the Bible that they were there. It must have happened because there's testimony of 6 million and nobody contradicted them. Okay. That in essence is Saady's argument. As we know it's true, Ibn Ezra later, not Ibn Ezra, but Yehuda Halevi will say the same thing. He goes on to say that human beings have free will. Something the moderns discuss today. We still have an argument over that. Biology and education and everything. So human beings can choose to lead good lives or not. We have full freedom of action. Therefore, there is reward and punishment, with the good being punished in this world for their sins, and the wicked conversely are rewarded. In the world to come, the roles are reversed. Now, this is a reflection of something found in the Talmud, which exactly says the same basic concept. How do we explain the suffering of the righteous and the prosperity of the wicked? There's no one who doesn't do some evil in their life, and there's no one who doesn't do some good in their life. So therefore, those who have a preponderance of evil get their reward here and now. So in the world to come, they won't have anything but punishment. Those who have preponderance of good receive their punishment in this world. So in the world to come, they look forward to only reward. So that is an attempt to balance out, whether you accept it or not, that's an attempt to balance out that reality. Okay, so now we're going to move west to Spain. Toledo, Ohio, no, Toledo, Spain. I'm full of all kinds of silly bits of information I'm going to skip. Born in 1085, dies around 1141, a man by the name of Judah Halevi, J-U-D-A-H, or Yehuda Halevi. You want the Yehuda Halevi. He was a poet as well as a philosopher, and his most important work was in some ways an anti-philosophical tract. And he's become especially popular in the last 30, 40 years in the yeshiva world. Now, it's built on a legend. The legend has some truth to it. In the area which is now, I guess, the Caucasus, I'm not sure what part of Europe, around Russia, there was a kingdom of the Khazars. And that we hear that either just the royal family or the royal family and some of the leadership of that area and or some of the general people converted to Judaism. Somewhere in the 8th century, 9th century, something along those lines. We don't have a lot of information beyond that. And Yehuda Halevi uses this to explain his philosophy of Judaism. And what it is, it's a dialogue between the king of the Khazars and a certain rabbi. Now, what happens is, the one explanation given for why the Khazars may have converted to Judaism is because to the north and to the northeast were Christians, to the south were Muslims, and you know, he's which way is he going to go, which kingdoms that he's going to bow to, what have you. So he thought he could be more neutral by being Jewish. That's an explanation given. But Yehuda Halevi says this king was interested in what was truth. And so he summons to him a philosopher. And the philosopher, that's why I say it's in many ways it's an anti-philosophical tract, essentially posits an uncaring creator who is not concerned with the ongoings of humanity. For philosophy, often, you've got the prime mover. God is the prime mover. It starts the ball rolling and it keeps going by itself. The unmoved mover, the prime mover. God has this idea of the deity is not one that is concerned with humanity. And that may fit well in some philosophical circles, but a lot of people find that to be very empty if they were looking for meaning in life. So the king is not satisfied with this vision of God. So he decides, well, the Jews, they're nobodies. In the Christian world, they're oppressed. In the Muslim world, they're oppressed. I'll forget them. But he calls a priest, a Christian, and a Muslim, an imam. And he questions them about God and things like that. And the Christian and Muslim both hearken back to the Bible and to Moses. So if they are going to see the reality, the origins of their religion in the Jewish world, why not go straight to a Jew? So he summons a rabbi. And so the rabbi seeks to explain in conversation with the king that God indeed does care about humanity. He also seconds Sadia's statement that we know that Revelation was true because it was witnessed at Sinai. And now here where it really is no longer in the philosophical, or at least the rationalist philosophical bent, he does not identify Judaism with rational truth, but claims it has a higher level of being the only truth. And he denies that metaphysics can arrive at higher truth. So he says the philosophical arguments can only get you so far and no further. For that other part to reach truth, you need God's revelation, because that's a truth that is above and beyond the human capacity. By the way, that's why it's very popular today in many of the Orthodox yeshivot, in contrast with Maimonides, that we'll get to in a minute, because it doesn't have to worry about rationality to a certain extent. Rationality can go so far. After that, you have to have belief in revelation. Okay? To Halevi, philosophy attempts to know God, while religion seeks to lead a life in accord with God's will. Think of that. The philosopher, what is God? That's what the philosopher is interested in. What is God? Who is God? What is God? Religion, especially Judaism, the Torah, isn't concerned with what is God, but what does God want of me? How can I follow a godly path? All right, so he accepts the notion of the medieval philosophers use the ideas of faculty. He accepts their idea that there's a rational faculty in the human mind. There's part of our mind that thinks rationally. But we also have a superior faculty in our mind, the religious faculty. It sees beyond that. Now, this faculty was inherent in Adam Harishon, the first human being, the first man. And now we're going to step into a little bit of racism. Sorry. Right? But was only given, it was only inherited the DNA, he didn't know from DNA, but he would have, in modern terms, that those genes were only inherited by some of his offspring, not all of his offspring. Finally, it's found in the Jewish people. Nobody else. And that's where we get into a little bit of the this racial idea. And he has some other things that says elsewhere that won't go into that. But he says that is why prophecy can only be found amongst Jews. I don't know what he did with the story of Bilam and Balak, but special dispensation, I don't know. And not only some Jews are capable of prophecy. So in the entire world of humanity, there's only one section of humanity that is capable of prophecy. And within that one people, there are only some that are capable of prophecy, using this religious faculty to the utmost. While the moral law is available to all humanity, it is not, this religious faculty is not, until the coming of the Messiah. Then things perhaps will change. And he gives special distinction not only to the children of Israel, but also to the land of Israel. He was a Zionist before there was such thing as Zionism. One of his poems, he says, I'm in the West, but my soul resides in the East. And we know that he, towards the end of his life, he departed Spain to go to the land of Israel. There's mention of him in Egypt, mention of him leaving to go to the land of Israel, and then he disappears from history. There's a famous legend that says when he got to Jerusalem that he bowed down to kiss the stones, and some crusader on horseman ran him over and killed him. And that's always been considered to be just a legend. However, I saw a fascinating paper a few years ago in which somebody sought to demonstrate that there's evidence out there that something like that really happened. There's a mention of some famous person who got killed by horsemen in Jerusalem around the same time, the right time. Okay. Now we come to the most famous of all of these names. Moses ben Maimon, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, Maimonides. By the way, the Maimonides is from using the Greek idea. IDES is son of. So Maimonides is the son of Maimon. Okay. So you can hear him referred to as the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, or Maimonides. 1135 to 1204. He wrote what is called the Guide for the Perplexed at the end of the 12th century, towards the end of the 12th century. He was an Aristotelian, rationalist, and halachist. And he sought to reconcile the tenets of Aristotelianism and biblical religion. In the Middle Ages, medieval period, the Muslim world rediscovered the Greek philosophers, translated many of their works from Greek into Arabic. And so there's a tremendous flourishing of philosophy in the Muslim world, especially. And the Jews in Spain were clearly affected by that and dealt with that. Yehuda Halevi, in part, was reacting against it. Maimonides was in favor of it. We see he was opposed by others because he was in favor of it. All right. So a little bit of background. He was born in Cordova. There's a statue of Rambam somewhere in Cordova today. He fled after the Almohad conquest in 1148. 1159, he settles in Fez in North Africa, and then in Fustat in 1165. Fustat is with the old city of Cairo. He also, apparently, he and his family did at first, or at some point, go to the land of Israel, but the difficulties were such that he went back to Egypt. He was a Talmudic scholar. We talked about his legal writings in some depth. Anytime you listen to any real Talmudic lesson, you will find almost always Maimonides being mentioned in the course of the discussion, how he ruled on the law in this passage in the Talmud. Because sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't seem to work. And all right, so between his legal weight and his influence on Talmudic studies, that would have been enough for anybody. But he was also interested in philosophy. And he says in the introduction to this work, it originally was written as a series of letters to a former student, who I think was in Baghdad at the time, with questions. See, one of the problems, Halevi is dealing with it in the negative, Maimonides also had to deal with it, was that philosophy has a tendency to challenge accepted truths, no matter what those accepted truths are. And that includes the accepted truths of religion. And frequently, it then becomes a ticket out of religious observance or out of the religious world. So the Rambam was seeking to find a way to bridge that gap and to show how everything that was accepted as Aristotelian truth, because Aristotle, he was the top dog at that time, been dead for a long time, but he was, his philosophy, Aristotelianism, was regnant in the world at that period of history. And so he has to deal with any apparent seeming contradiction between Aristotle and the Bible. So one of the things he starts off with, well, actually, when you look at the Guide for Perplexity, he starts off with explaining what words mean. For example, we have in the opening chapters of Genesis, B'Tselem Elohim bara otam. God created him in B'Tselem Udemut, whatever, the image and likeness of God. What does that mean? Does that mean God has 2 arms and 2 legs? Receding hairline? What does it mean? So he seeks to explain the language. And he really, in some ways, is very modern. A lot of modern philosophy is dealing with language. All right, so the Guide for Perplexity opens with language, but the important elements that he's dealing with is, let's talk about the attributes of God. All right, he's merciful, he's long-suffering, he's forgiving, he's X, Y, Z, whatever. He says you can't say that really. You cannot say anything positive about God, God's attributes. Because the moment you say something positive, you are limiting. To say, the example I like to give, all right, Bill Gates is a millionaire. Well, on a level, yeah, he is a millionaire several times over. By calling him a millionaire, I've now limited him. So once you say something positive, you are limiting that to which you are seeking to attribute that attribute. all you can say is a negative. God is not without mercy. God is not without kindness. He does a better job than I can explain right now. But this is what we call negative assertions, and the negative attributes of God. You can only say what God is not. You can never truly say a positive attribute of God. He too has to deal with the anthropomorphisms of the Bible. Again, following like Saadia. Saadia was following in the footsteps of the Talmud. And when the Bible uses anthropomorphisms, it must always be understood as referring to his actions, not any physicality. And he asserts in the Mishnah Torah that to believe that God has a physical body is heresy. And I mentioned that earlier, that the Raavad took him to task for that. And we know there was literature, Jewish literature, that talks about the dimensions of God. But nonetheless, the Rambam says we cannot take that on a literal level. We have to understand any anthropomorphic statement as about the actions of God, not about any physical description of God. Now, according to Aristotle, the universe is eternal. Always was and always will be. Generally speaking, Judaism has stressed the idea of God's creation of the universe. God action in Hebrew, yesh me'ayin, or in Latin, ex nihilo, creating out of nothing. If you look at many mythologies of the ancient world, there is a primordial existence, matter, something that precedes the birth of the gods. The gods rise up out of this eternal whatever. And the world gets fashioned from it, maybe by the gods, but they didn't create it. Right? So this was part of Aristotle's heritage, and he went with this concept that the world, the physical world, is eternal. And we still fight over that. We have the Big Bang Theory, right? Which posits the universe came out of something or nothing or whatever that was. But now they found some other universes or something further away that doesn't seem to fit in that. So who knows what's going to happen next? We'll come back to the Big Bang when we talk about mysticism next week. All right. But some would say, there are those who want to say that even if the universe came into being, it's eternal from then on. It may eventually wear out. But what this also does, by saying that it is universal, the universe is infinite, it means really you can't have miracles. You can't interrupt the universe's setup. And it makes it's a challenge to traditional Judaism. Now, the Rambam, interestingly enough, says that Aristotle made a mistake in his logic. But significantly, the Rambam seems to hedge his bets a little bit, and implies that had he been unable to disprove Aristotle, he could fit Aristotle into traditional Judaism. And one of the questions that is really big in the modern world when studying Maimonides is, can you always believe what he's saying? Is he sometimes saying something for the masses or to protect his rear end, as it were? And if you dig deeper, you will see that he really believes something else. Leo Strauss is famous in investigating that. Leo Strauss, not Levi Strauss of the dungarees. All right. So it is possible, and some argue that really he believed Aristotle was correct, but he couldn't say it. But he, and when we look at this creation story, you can see how one could finagle that a little bit. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. At the beginning, when God created heaven and earth, the world was tohu vavohu, primordial matter, and God just fashions it. You could create an interpretation that way. All right. Another important element in Maimonides' philosophy is the concept of the golden mean. You should not be quick to get angry. On the other hand, you should not be so uncaring or whatever, passive, that you let anything go. Somewhere in the middle is the proper attitude. It's like, as a parent, you have to decide how to discipline your child. You can't not discipline them ever. On the other hand, God forbid you should go too far. You have to find what is the middle path. There's a middle path between being miserly and being profligate. Some people throw away their money and they lose out. Some people don't give away any of their money and they lose out. The proper course is in the middle. He says that about just about every kind of aspect of life except for humility. He says when it comes to humility, you go to the extreme. There's a famous passage in which he refers to it's not clear who the individual was Jewish or not, that he was traveling with some companions and they didn't have any money. He goes down to the bottom of the boat to go to sleep and he's dressed in rags, and some wealthy man comes by and ends up urinating on him. Because he a bunch of rags there, so he urinates them on. And his friends see that, he says, I'm happy. I was able to be so humble that even that didn't bother me. I don't advise it for anyone, but he says that's a concept he finds there. So not stingy, not profligate, not ascetic, but to limit your physical pleasures. Now, as I said, the Rambam Maimonides says some things in the guide, some things in the Mishnah Torah that set off alarm bells in many circles. And his works were burned by some Jews. And it may be, the reality is that it was their first burning of books that later on led to the great catastrophe of Jewish works being burned. But he had impact beyond the Jewish world. And there were some Christian philosophers who were familiar with his writings, and it influenced their work as well. Okay. Now, but there was a turning away from philosophy, and we'll see that when we talk about the mysticism next week. But after Maimonides in the golden age of Spain, philosophy seems to have kind of played out to some extent and wasn't terribly influential in the Jewish world until we get to the beginning of the modern era. And one of those individuals that are important to be aware of was another Moses, Moses Mendelssohn, 1729 through 1786. So he was a product of the Enlightenment. Now, this is the beginning of the movements of liberal thought and the possibilities of Jews leaving the ghetto. Right? So he was at this time of history when the door was opening a little bit. It was, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism as official kinds of product. He wanted to go to Berlin and he had to get permission to live in Berlin because only so many Jews were allowed to be in the city. And he studied philosophy. As with many of the Jewish philosophers, he was a proponent of the ideal of reason. Reason belongs to the world. If that is the case, then what does the Torah have to offer? Again, he runs into this problem. If the human mind is capable of arriving at truth through reason, what do you need revelation for? Because if it's true, it's the possession of all reasonable people. So Mendelssohn divides truths known to all men and women of reason from revealed religion and the revealed law. Monotheism, morality, immortality of the soul, these are the truths open to all. Any person of reason would arrive at these ideas. Judaism, on the other hand, is the revealed laws of the Torah, a specific way of living life in order to express oneself religiously. There are some, it's not clear, that want to say that Moses Mendelssohn felt that Judaism had no revealed dogmas, only laws. We do know that he was the ushering in the age of enlightenment. He was a religious Jew. There's no question about it. But he wanted to bring Jews out of the ghetto. He translated the Bible into German, the Hebrew Bible into German, because Jews knew the Hebrew Bible, and they could learn German and not speak Yiddish from this biblical translation. It's unclear if he had any intention of changing Jewish law, but we know that he became anathema to the more Orthodox world, and some claim he was the forerunner of Reform Judaism. So his grandchildren all were converts to Christianity. They left the fold. Now, I always want to talk about Krochma, and I always skip Krochma, so we're going to skip Krochma. All right, now let's turn to the mid-19th century, the second end of it rather, 1878, Martin Buber. Martin Buber was an Austrian Jewish philosopher, theologian as well. He was born in Vienna. His parents were fairly assimilated, but his grandfather was a religious, scholarly Jew. And he spent a lot of time with his grandfather and who lived amongst Hasidim, and he was very interested in the Hasidic way, the way of seeing the world. And that influenced what he had to say later on, and also some of his works either are a reflection of Hasidism or he explains Hasidism as basically makes it a reflection of his philosophy. You know, it's not clear. Is he describing Hasidism, or is he describing Buberism using the Hasidim? Right? You know, he was a journalist for a while. He edited the monthly journal called the Yudah, the Jew, from 1916 to 1924. He taught comparative religion at Frankfurt from 1923 to 33. And he directed a Jewish adult education program until 1938, when he fled to Palestine to escape the Nazis. And he became a professor of social philosophy at Jerusalem Hebrew University, where he wrote on social and ethical problems. He's best known for his religious philosophy, expounded most famously in a work in German, Ich und Du, if I pronounce it correctly, 1923, I and Thou. Contrasting personal relationships of mutuality and reciprocity with utilitarian or objective relationships. Buber says, you can relate to another something else in two ways. You can relate to it in a mechanistic, utilitarian manner, or you can relate to it on a personal level. It can be an I and it, we would say, a relationship, or an I and thou relationship. There's no English word for the do. It's a personal. That's where you translate as thou. Give you a great example. I go to the grocery store. Go to Walmart, couple items. I go to the self-checkout, right? That's a machine. I have a great picture of my grandson doing it, all right? 4 years old and he's doing it, all right? It's a machine, right? I don't care about it. Just make sure it's correct. No mistakes. Got a lot of items. I go to Sobeys or go to No Frills. Got to go to the checkout line. Is that a person or a machine in front of me? I can relate to that as a person, or I can relate to them as a machine, an I or an it. I try, I'm not always successful. I try to find their names. Sometimes they don't wear them anymore. I don't know, it's the problem. We have a name tag. I try to thank Judy, Sarah, whatever their name is when I leave. I would never thank a machine. So we can relate to people in one of two ways. I, thou, I, it. Now there is a thou that is always a thou. The eternal thou, the divine. I can relate to the eternal thou if I choose to. It's always a thou. I can't turn God into an it. He opens his book by talking about relating to a tree. To relate to the tree as a thing and it, or to relate to it as the entity that it is. It's a beautiful philosophy, the beautiful idea of relationships. He had probably, I would say, greater impact in the non-Jewish world, really, than in the Jewish world. He was not a religious man, and in contrast with another individual who lived around the same time, I skipped a man by the name of Franz Rosenzweig. Franz Rosenzweig died very young. He was born in 1886 and died in 1929. And he wrote his famous work called The Star of Redemption in the trenches and during the war. He describes revelation as dialogical occurrence of language, whatever that means. It's a very difficult work to read, but he was in opposition to the Hegelian approach to history in the world. And he too was talking about relationships, I versus it, and in a world in which we turn God into an it. That you could talk about and think of God just as would any other object. And he talks about the new thinking, which assumes that the I receives itself in the you. So the challenging call of revelation of our eyes and ears are opened. The human eye is dull, he writes, and dumb, and waits for the redeeming word of God. Adam, where are you? To this first loud you comes the first timid I of shame. The relationship moves in the I and the you, and again in the I. Now he believes that truth is something different from the truth of philosophers. It has to be, and we have to make it our truth. It's not just simple philosophical ramblings. Truth has to become our truth. Well, truth is no longer what is true, but it becomes that which has been proved to be true. This is the continuous task of synagogue and church, to prove the one truth of God. Truth which is given to them only as a divided earthly truth. And they do this in prayer and commandment, with which they keep the thirst for the eternal kingdom of redemption unquenched in the midst of the unredeemed kingdoms of the world. Each prays and lives according to truth as each receives and understands. Now he's making it somewhat relative. And he does take a somewhat more positive approach to Jewish tradition. Martin Buber essentially says, if a mitzvah speaks to me, then I will observe it. If it doesn't speak to me, I won't. Rosenzweig kind of puts it in a little more positive spin and says, I might say not yet. I'm not there yet. He doesn't reject it, but he may not be yet ready for it. I can try and do it. I'm not going to ask you to explain all of that. I want you to basically recognize the name, recognize the basic work that is ascribed to them. You know, this is just a overview of it. Like I said, I try to give you the overview. I don't expect it all to be absorbed. I hope some of it will. So at least I hope, you know, when you go out in the world, Franz, I heard that name somewhere. What is Franz? You know, oh yeah, I remember Rabbi Berman said something about him and Martin Buber and these guys. You know, Martin Buber and I and thou. Franz Rosenzweig, The Star of Redemption. Moses Maimonides, The Guide for the Perplexed. You know, those are the, you know, at least to be able to identify the name and their major work, that's important. And have an idea where they fit into the Jewish world. I want to touch upon two more individuals, Mordechai Kaplan and Abraham Joshua Heschel. And they are worlds apart. But they both, interestingly enough, were at the Jewish Theological Seminary for a while at the same time. Okay. Mordechai Kaplan was born in 1881. and died in 1983. He was an alter cocker, as they say. All right. Very interesting man. Yeah. He was heavily influenced by modern rationalism and scientific thought to such an extent that he rejected the idea of a personal God. For him, God was the force for good in the universe. Kaplan, he begins his life as an Orthodox Jew. He ends up, after becoming the rabbi of an Orthodox synagogue, to being the founder of a movement that he didn't really want to found, but Reconstructionist Judaism. Okay, so he begins this journey, and as he goes through the journey, he sees, and I think he still has the best definition of Judaism. He basically defines Judaism as as a religious civilization. Judaism is a religious civilization. Civilization includes language, art, music, all kinds of things. Right? So I think it's probably the best definition. Is Judaism really is the totality of all of that. Judaism is not a religion. That's one of the real problems that people have well, I won't go there yet. It's perhaps why Judaism is sick today, is because people think of it as only a religion. And everybody's religion is different, so there's no such thing as Judaism for everybody. But anyway, so because of his acceptance of the very rationalistic view of the world, scientific view of the world, he rejects a personal God. Says there's no personal God, there can be no such thing as mitzvot, commandments. You can't have commandments without someone who commands. Right?
Let's turn it all apart.
Yeah, that's why he says the Jewish civilization needs to be reconstructed. Hence, Reconstructionism. All right. And so,
They don't believe in redemption.
well, it depends on what you mean by believing. Kaplan would say, for example, commandments can't come from God. But commandments, what we call mitzvot, are Jewish folkways. This is what Jews do. It's not that we do it because we're commanded. Who commands? Who's got the power to command? There's no such thing as law. Law implies enforcement. Maybe back in Europe in the pre-modern era, when you had a Jewish community that could enforce its rules, you could speak of Jewish law. In a world in which no one can compel you to fulfill a religious act, and you reject that it's a divine commandment, it can only be what Jews do. Jews celebrate Hanukkah. Does it matter if you do it 8 days, 9 days, 1 day? Well, that's what your community does. Does it matter if it really happened or not happened? It's fun. Purim's coming up. Does it matter whether or not there's any reality behind this story? No, it's a fun holiday. We have a good time. You don't have to be Jewish even to do the Jewish things, right? So, but if you want to be part of the Jewish people, part of the Jewish civilization, you have to do what Jews do. And Jews decide what they want to do. So that tradition has a voice. Tradition tells us something, but we decide if we can listen to the voice. Right? So now here's a, eventually said that at a time, he and Heschel would be in the same faculty meeting and they're 2 worlds apart. We haven't got to Heschel yet. Okay. He originally did not want to create a separate movement, but eventually the Reconstructionist movement was created, a separate rabbinical school, which I think today, to be honest with you, I think he would be spinning in his grave if he believed you could be spinning in your grave at where Reconstructionism has gone. Okay, because it is not the rationalistic view that he had, I don't think. It's much more affected by mystical, feel-good, other kinds of elements in that aspect of Jewish life. All right. So I don't think he'd feel at home with it. Interesting enough, there's just published his diaries. He kept for a long time a journal. And there's a big review on the Jewish Review of Books that I just got my copy today. It tells a story. He went to see Louis Ginsburg. It was. Louis Ginsburg was a professor of Talmud at the seminary, a very important Talmudic scholar. He wanted to go visit him on Shabbat afternoon. But he knew you don't just pop in, that world, you just, in those days, the 30s or whatever it was, you don't just pop in without invitation to someone's home. You let them know you'd like to come by. So he calls the house. And the maid, the non-Jewish maid, answers the phone. And Louis Ginsburg wouldn't come to the phone to speak to him. But he says he's coming over. And then when he goes over, he kind of gave Louis Ginsburg a hard time for not speaking on the telephone. Okay. But in any case, he had a big impact on many voices in the conservative movement. And even after the Reconstructionist movements came into being, his influence was still is perhaps felt at the seminary. Now, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the last name we're going to deal with, was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1907. Now, Abraham Joshua Heschel was the son of a long chain of Hasidic rabbis. One was known as Abraham Yoshua Heschel. Abraham Joshua Heschel is named after, I don't know how far back that was. Now, Hasidic Jewry places a great emphasis on the inner spiritual life of the religious individual. And Heschel grew up surrounded by a world of profound spirituality, a world of faith. And although he later went on to the University of Berlin to pursue secular intellectual studies, he continued to draw on the wellsprings of his early religious experiences throughout his lifetime. I would say, in essence, essentially, he was an Orthodox man through his entire life. He fled Germany during the Holocaust. And, people went out wherever they could. He was able to obtain a invitation to teach at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which was the center of the Reform movement, rabbinical school. And he apparently was miserable there. It just was not his world. And eventually ended up at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was more akin to him, but he too, but still there, he was kind of, in some ways, out of water. What's amazing is people are sometimes put off or overwhelmed by his style of writing. Here's a man, comes from Germany, Yiddish, Hebrew, Aramaic, comes to America and hardly speaks any English. Few years later, he is writing beautiful works. God in Search of Man, Man is Not Alone, The Sabbath. The English is worth reading it, even just for the language. And he doesn't give a straightforward presentation of religious philosophy supported by proofs and arguments. His writing is really more poetic. His books are description of faith rather than argument for faith. And his style is deliberate, reflecting his understanding of language and religion. Indeed, it seems that language and faith are closely related in Heschel's thought. So now, as he says, he does not believe that the root of faith lies in the realm of rational argumentation. He says, quote, "When the soul is not aflame, no light of speculation will illumine the darkness of indifference. No masterly logical demonstration of God's existence or any analysis of the intricacies of the traditional God concepts will succeed in dispersing that darkness. Proofs may aid in protecting, but not in initiating certainty. Essentially, they are explications of what is already intuitively clear to us. For a religious Jew, you don't need proof of God. It may help you a little bit, the proofs and everything, but you don't need it. You believe in God. If you don't believe in God, proofs aren't going to do anything. No one's going to become religious because they've been proven that God exists. Reason is not the root of faith. Faith comes before reason. Its roots are our preconceptual perception of the world. It is our preconceptual reactions to the world, wonder, awe. You see God in the awe of the universe. There's more to the world than what we understand. Persons of faith first experience God in the world and only then try to come to terms with that experience through reason. Modern men and women have closed themselves off to their preconceptual experiences by being too literally minded, by ignoring the poetry that is inherent in creation. They have closed themselves off to the possibility of faith. There's one of the most important pictures of Heschel is a picture of him marching alongside Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, Alabama. The Jewish the Rabbinical Assembly, I believe it was in Chicago at the time, was having a meeting, the annual convention, when this took place, and Heschel left to go to march with Martin Luther King. He's the guy with the big bushy hair and the straight beard coming down, roly-poly man, he was. Mrs. Coretta Scott King, in recalling that event, called Heschel, quote, one of the great men of our time. Rabbi Heschel described the march in these words: "For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was both protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying." He was involved in a lot of areas opposing the war in Vietnam, for example, clearly in favor of again, in opposition to segregation and allowing for everyone to be part of the world. Heschel's contribution to contemporary thought is well reflected in the titles of his theological works: Man is Not Alone, God in Search of Man, Who is Man? Underlying much of his theological perspective is what Edward Kaplan has called the displacement of subjectivity. The Bible, Heschel helped us to see, frequently presents matters from a divine perspective. It thus reflects more divine anthropology than human theology. Heschel as I said, very much in the Hasidic world, affected by the mystical vision. He talks about the prophets in some way relating to the pathos of God. And God cares. God cares for the world. Heschel viewed prayer not as an encounter with God, but as an event of being encountered by God. In prayer, he taught our asking of God gives way before the awareness of being asked by God. Heschel taught that religion begins with a question, and that theology begins with a problem. He went so far to assert that a person without a problem may not be a person. His teaching was not directed at resolving our problems as much as provoking our questions. Even then, his most common response in class was, quote, "Is that the real question?" I had the opportunity not to study with him. I started the Jewish Theological Seminary the year he passed away. So I really never got that opportunity. I understand he was horrible in class. And we could understand him. He had a nice Yiddish accent. But he was sometimes belittled, but he has one of his last works, which I'm slowly making my way through it over the years, is entitled Torah min hashamayim aspakleri hadorot, Torah from heaven through the refraction of the generations. And it's a masterful work. He has got a tremendous command of all of the Talmudic literature. That is not something you usually think of when you think of him, but it was masterful. But here you have, and this is one of the interesting things about the seminary in those days. I don't know if it's true anymore, but in the days of Kaplan and Heschel and Lieberman, and earlier with Louis Ginsburg, you would have on one end a mystic. On the other end, you had this supreme rationalist, God is the source for good in the universe. Famously, I think it was Solomon Schechter, suppose he said that you can't be a rabbi in America if you don't understand baseball. So he's trying to bridge those gaps. I don't know if it worked or not, but Kaplan apparently despised Heschel, and I don't know if the feeling was returned. I don't know, but they were very different. There are many other important names, many important individuals, and since this is sponsored by the conservative movement, I really haven't touched upon the Orthodox philosophers our day and age. If this were an Orthodox situation, there would be much more time spent on the Dov Ber Soloveitchik, Joseph Ber Soloveitchik. But this is just a taste of what Jewish philosophy is all about. It's the struggle to maintain Judaism in the face of philosophical worldviews, and how you can amalgamate the two together has been the basic approach of most Jewish philosophers or that we would come across. The difference in general, though, would be how much yet it's the more modern part of the Jewish world is prepared to speak with and through and contend with philosophers of all types. Kierkegaard, for example, all right, it is certainly a name that Heschel was conversing with, as was Soloveitchik. You will not find that in the very Orthodox world. They do not have, and it's a holdover from the Maimonidean disputes, and it's the reason why mysticism perhaps replaced philosophy as the king of Jewish thought beyond the Talmud and the Bible. It's next week. Okay. You're welcome. Have a good night, everyone. Happy.
Have a good
Purim.
night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I have a question.
Yes.